Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine war news update, second part thereafter, the 21st of October 2024. I was somewhat tongue-tied in starting this video just now. Let's hope I can get my words out in a coherent fashion. Not too much to report in terms of military aid to Ukraine or indeed Russia. Not an awful lot of news has come out over the weekend. But we are going to start with something I have reported before, which is the claim that the US may lift the veto on Ukraine's NATO invitation if Harris wins the election, according to Le Monde. Now, I'd said this before, that, you know, they are warming to the US is warming to the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. And there was talk about Biden being the guy that was going to sort that out post-election if Harris wins. There's also the claim that the restrictions on missiles may be lifted if Harris wins again. Her national security advisor likely to be Philip Gordon, who I think is a bit more hawkish, stronger than, say, Jake Sullivan on Ukraine and these kinds of conflicts. But we'll have to wait and see. That is the kind of general understanding of what would happen, because at the end of the day she has to differentiate herself from Biden. Biden is doing what Biden's doing at the moment, which is arguably not enough to support Ukraine. So either you go the other way, which is towards Trump, or you go further into supporting Ukraine. So I think it's generally understood that she's likely to go further into supporting Ukraine. So you might see more equipment, lifting of restrictions, joining NATO, and really doubling down on support of Ukraine there. Ukraine is developing this Sting drone interceptor, says no reports, which can fly at speeds of over 160 kilometers an hour and up to altitudes of 3 kilometers. Although I've seen someone else report is 10,000 meters, so I don't know. The operator will control it through VR glasses, and in the future they plan to add an artificial intelligence system for automatic targeting. The Sting will cost 10 times less than the Shahed 136 that it hopes to take out. So that's really good news. This innovation, the arms race that's taking place, particularly with regard to these Shahed drones. Well, you got to drones in general. You got the measure and the countermeasure, and then you do a countermeasure and a countermeasure, so on and so forth. There's your arms race. So the threat is, you can look at this with Shahed drones, and you can look at it with reconnaissance drones. Right, we have a problem. Shahed drones keep coming in and blowing stuff up. So what do we do? It's all about problem solving, and then problem solving. So with Shaheds, right, okay, well, we as Ukrainians, we are going to create loads of audio listening posts to hear for the sound of drones, and then we can spatially locate these drones, and that will help us to acquire them as targets and then send out people to go and take them down, or have missile systems or whatever. So, okay, we need audio listening posts, we need a good radar network, we need all of these things in place, and then they have mobile air defense units, from machine guns on the back of, and small arms fire on the back of utes, to Patriot missile systems, everything in between, all with the ability to acquire these targets and shoot them down. So the Russians at the same time are like, okay, we're going to make the Shaheds, we're going to paint them black. We're going to make them fly higher in the sky. We're going to make so they're out of range of, say, the small arms fire and some of these machine guns, etc., etc. And then we're going to have them go slightly faster. And then we're going to have a bunch of dud ones without warheads to kind of fool you guys. And we're going to have reconnaissance ones. We're going to have ones that map the terrain, etc., etc. So there's all this kind of movement one way, then another. And then the Ukrainians here now go, okay, we're going to get drones to take out these drones. In the same way that we used FPV drones as a countermeasure to the Orlan, the Supercam, and the Zala reconnaissance drones, we're going to generate one that can possibly use AI. And then the Russians, you would have thought, would go, okay, well, we need to create Shahed drones with AI or this or that. And Ukraine is also spoofing these drones. We've seen often more drones taken out by electronic warfare than by conventional interception. So the Russians will then be working on ways to combat electronic warfare interference, etc., etc., etc. Now, worryingly, as says Anton Gerashchenko reports, the commander of the United States Europe Command, General Christopher Cavoli, has said that the Russian army after the war may be stronger than it is today. In an interview with Der Spiegel, he said NATO should not be under any illusions about Russia's military strength. Absolutely, don't play it down. I get that. Quote, Russia has suffered losses in Ukraine, quite heavy losses, but the Russian armed forces are learning, they are improving, they are applying the experience gained at war. So just what we were talking about with regard to drones, course, they are adapting. Like, it's very easy to paint Russia as this horrific war machine that's just not very good at anything and just sends people into their deaths in these meat wave attacks against fortified positions. They do that. And they are that to some degree, but they all are also adapting and learning and doing things well. You know, it's not universally the case that they are messing things up. So they are improving. They are applying their experience gained at war. He said, at the end of the war in Ukraine, whatever it looks like, the Russian army will be stronger than it is today. Depends how you define stronger, of course. They may have more people in the army, but they may be somewhat experienced, but they are going to be in a situation where they have had attrited away most of their best soldiers. You look at the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade being reconstituted 9 times or whatever. They are a shadow of what they initially were at the beginning of the war, because they were used traditionally in kind of conventional manners in ways in which those kind of units are unaccustomed, right? It's supposed to be crack units used here and then pull them out and get your conventionals in. They've just been used to do these meat assaults themselves. And so I don't know. I think the Russian army will take generations to get back up to any kind of decent standard in terms of, you look at all the deep storage equipment that's been attrited, exhausted, arguably in some categories, and their production schedules and capacities are not meeting the losses that they are that are being incurred. And so therefore, I just think it will take an awful long time for them to be able to mount any similar sort of war as the one they are doing now. But there will be elements, there will be ways in which they are stronger. So there will be a knowledge base. They will have done some innovation in terms of electronic warfare, countermeasures for drones, and drone warfare itself. So there will be these considerations that need to be thought through. They are commanded by the same people, says Cavoli, who already see us as enemies and will then be very unhappy with how the war went. So we will have an opponent with real skills, a lot of troops, and clear intentions. Of course, the question is whether those troops will be, well trained, and yes, there will be some experience there, but they are trawling around getting people from convicts from prisons. Still, they're trying to exhaust every avenue to get people onto the front lines and people from abroad. So I don't know whether the quality of their troops will be the same as where they were at the beginning of the war, but at the beginning of the war, they didn't exactly equip themselves particularly well. So, yeah. Anyway, opponent with real skills, a lot of troops, and clear intentions. That is why we must be prepared and need armed forces that can withstand it. What you would hope the situation will be at the end of this war, whenever it comes, is that Ukraine would have been used by the West. And I don't mean this pejoratively. I mean, this is simply what's happening. Ukraine said, we don't want your troops, we'll do the fighting, you give us the stuff. So actually, Ukraine are fighting on behalf of the West. This is why I've long said it's a proxy war, but not in a pejorative sense. Not in that we sent them to fight for us and that we made the war happen and this is our war, we're just using you. My understanding of this being a proxy war is that you guys have been invaded by Russia. We didn't start that. Russia started that. Moral culpability is on Russia. You're fighting it. You don't want us, our troops, we'll send you weapons, but you are fighting on our behalf. That's why we're sending you weapons, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing all this stuff. We are doing all this because it's strategically important that you fight for us. So you are doing the fighting. You are getting attrited yourself, but you're attriting the Russians away at this tremendous rate. And so at the end of this war, you will get degraded Russian armed forces. There's absolutely no doubt of that, with ships sunk and not replaced, with tanks blown up and not replaced at the required numbers, and with most of your decent troops attrited. Meanwhile, we are extracting knowledge as the West and as NATO and as the EU and as the UK and as Japan and South Korea and Australia. We are extracting knowledge. We have these capability coalitions. So the drone coalition that's working on providing stuff for Ukraine, but extracting knowledge and having this feedback loop where we are providing better equipment for ourselves, learning from what's going on there, working with Ukraine, and we'll have Ukraine as an ally after the end of the war. And we can use all that knowledge to train ourselves up to a better position. That as strong as Russia might be, I don't want to be too positive about this, but I think as strong as Russia will be after this war, the rest of the world will be even stronger. We are learning, and we are also the US is giving equipment to Ukraine and replacing it with better equipment. So take the US, for example, but you can say the same for all the countries in Europe that are providing stuff and then starting to spend more on defense. We are getting into better and better positions with our defense and understanding what the threats of the world are more accurately, to the point where, say this war finishes in 2027, right? The war finishes, Russia's massively attrited, the rest of the West and allies are sitting pretty, having ramped up defence spending, having ramped up the military-industrial complex, and having worried enough to get troops recruited, etc., and working much better as a unified organisation, and NATO, etc., and the EU. The Russians might be dangerous and have a bigger army, but so will we, I think to an even greater extent. Now, after North Korea's aid to Russia, says Sarin here, and now South Korea summons a Russian ambassador. 12,000 North Korean soldiers are said to be on their way to the war in Ukraine. So interesting ramifications there. South Korea seeming to be stepping up. This could be a bit of an own goal for Russia. So yes, they're going to get North Korean soldiers, and they've got an awful lot of ammunition and weaponry from North Korea, KN-23 missiles, etc. But South Korea is a sleeping giant in terms of support for Ukraine and in terms of now in the top 10. I mean, they were number 8 much earlier in the war as a defense exporter. They've moved into the top 10. They're probably even higher now. I don't know. They have been kind of actively at war with North Korea for all this time. So they will have not only a huge stockpile of weaponry and munitions, but also they are in a great position to be able to reactively, very efficiently and cost effectively support Ukraine. They've got a really, that's why they're undercutting people like Rheinmetall and, not Rheinmetall, whoever makes the Leopards, KWS or whatever. They're able to undercut the European and American manufacturers of main battle tanks and weapon systems because they have economies of scale and arguably cheaper labor, etc. So South Korea is a big old player, and if they are able to be brought into the Allied assembly there, then much more formally and actually directly providing, instead of backfilling other nations, directly providing aid to Ukraine, then North Korea's entrance into the war could actually end up costing Russia more. That would be a very positive outlook of the situation, because I am worried about what North Korea is doing. Now, a recently intercepted North Korean missile in Ukraine, KN-23 ballistic missile, was found to contain newly produced electronics from several Western firms. Analog devices from the US, XP Power from the UK, NXP from the Netherlands, Vargo from the US. These companies are at best negligent and at worst complicit, says Timothy Milovanov, the former Minister of Economics for Ukraine. NATO, most of microelectronic components were manufactured in the USA, while the others can be traced to Switzerland, the Netherlands and the UK. The full list of companies, and then it lists a whole bunch of other companies there, which you can see on this infographic or screen grab. KN-23 or 24 missile with an alleged serial number and it lists the serial number, was shot down on September the 7th near Myrna and Beliki villages in Poltava Oblast, Ukraine, by the armed forces of Ukraine. And there you go, you can see some of it there. And that gives you the list of the companies that are involved in supporting the manufacture of these missiles. Now, whether it is a case of, well, we sold it to this person who then sells it to this, and you get this strangled route that goes all the way to North Korea, I don't know, but something needs to be done about that, and I wonder what those companies, their response is. Now, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has said that he spoke with South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol about NATO's strong partnership with Seoul, defense cooperation, and the linked security of the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. He also warned that North Korea sending troops to support Russia in Ukraine would be a major escalation. Now, I go back to my previous point. This could be a bit of an own goal for Putin in getting the North Koreans involved, thinking this is going to upset the apple cart with regard to the US elections. And that's why, so in my last video I talked about there being a muted response to this, actually for very good reason. So lots of people are going, North Korea getting involved, why is no one talking about this? And it could be actually because that's exactly what North Korea want. And that's exactly what Putin wants. He wants there to be a massive kickback about this, and then blaming the Biden Harris administration for being hawkish and escalatory and getting North Korea involved in a war, and it's all your fault, therefore we should vote you out and get Trump in. That's exactly what these guys want. And so therefore the best response is to actually downplay the North Korean situation. And I think there's a lot of merit to that theory. I really do. Because I was thinking, why, I'm so angry. This is worrying. I now get it. If that, at least to me, that's a plausible theory. But it's really good that NATO behind the scenes are going to have meetings with South Korea and saying, this shit's serious. We need to do stuff, blah, blah, blah. And then, NATO, Mark Rutte, I think, taking a strong position. I mean, the good thing about Mark Rutte taking over at NATO is, and some people are critical, some Dutch people are critical about him. He's been in charge for Holland for the Netherlands for so long, but hasn't done this or has done that. Some people like him, some people don't. Okay, from a domestic political point of view, yeah, whatever. But from just simply anyone, I mean, A, he's quite strong in terms of support for Ukraine, and B, he's been strong in repudiating, I believe, at one of these meetings with Trump, and Trump begrudgingly gave him some respect. This is why he was thought to be the better choice than someone like Kaja Kallas or someone else that could have been in charge of NATO. Is Mark Rutte stood up to Trump before that he's the guy we need in NATO in case Trump wins, etc., etc. Okay, so then there's that. But just from a generic point of view, whoever comes into Secretary General of NATO, and it's like Harris coming in, exactly the same theory about taking over from Biden. How do you differentiate yourself from your previous person? No disrespect to the previous person, but I'm a new guy and I need to stamp my authority here, and I need to show myself to be X, Y, and Z. So either he becomes dovish or he becomes more, I wouldn't say hawkish, but more robust in what NATO stands for and how it's going to defend its objectives and Ukraine. And so Mark Rutte here is going to be coming in and going, right, I need to get to work. Let's do stuff to make me, as just a simple human psychology, to make me look good, so that people reflect, this reflects well on me, and I'm thought to be a decent leader. Everyone wants to be the best they can, to do the best they can, especially in roles like this. You don't take over and go, right, this is going to be a walk in a park. I'm just going to sit back, put my feet up, and take in my lovely wage, thank you very much, and go on as many holidays as possible. Like, you can't do that in a position like that. So he's like, right, I've got a job to do and I've got to be seen to do it well. So how do I differentiate myself from Stoltenberg? Now, Stoltenberg did a pretty good job, but I need to be, I think, stronger. So he's going around, right, South Korea, what's going on here? What are these douchebags doing? Helping out Russia. What are you doing about that? Right? What can we do to help you? We need to work together. You're not in NATO, but actually NATO is now involved not just in this North Atlantic Treaty, like the whole kind of Cold War going from the US to Europe. We're now interested in the Indo-Pacific. What's going on there? How can we work with Japan? How can we work? And we've got these other sort of people like Australia, New Zealand, etc. And then you've got Five Eyes and blah blah blah. So he's going and sorting all this stuff out. I think that's super important. Shashank Joshi from The Economist is quoting, I presume, Luke McGee here. Rutte requested that the South Korean government send a delegation to NATO to share more detailed information, and expressed hope that South Korea, Ukraine and NATO will strengthen defence cooperation and security dialogue in the future to respond to North Korea's deployment of troops. This is really good. So actually, Mark Rutte is doing, because I've talked to you guys before about the need for someone in Europe to be a leader, because you've got almost 30 countries in a union, and those countries are of varying sizes, and you have different leaders with different strengths and weaknesses in charge of their country for whatever reason. So you're looking at what you've got there and you think, well, this is a strong leader, that's a strong leader, but the countries are too small. So unfortunately, I mean, you'd like it not to be this case, but it is the case that, really strong leaders, say Estonia, Kaja Kallas, is not going to drive Europe on, right? So I know she's now moved into a European parliamentary position, but when she was leader of Estonia, as strong as she was in support of Ukraine and driving up support for Ukraine in Europe, she isn't in charge of a country of 70 million people or whatever. She's not France, Germany, Italy, Spain. And without the UK, you've basically got those four countries, France, Germany, Italy, Spain a little bit further behind. One of those leaders needs to be driving Europe on. And that's really only, I think, Emmanuel Macron there. Giorgia Meloni in a coalition, very right wing. Don't know that that's unifying enough. And Olaf Scholz, say no more. So really, Emmanuel Macron, he was stepping up and he was doing all that stuff. And then you had the European elections, and then the snap French elections, and then the Olympics. And he sort of had to taking this back seat now, which is a real shame because he was being super strong. So who is there to do this? Well, actually, Mark Rutte, as the former Dutch prime minister, is someone who has been around in European politics for a long time. He has a lot of respect from people. He's not a divisive character. He's generally liked across Europe, and the Netherlands is a fairly central country there, and in the position of Secretary General of NATO, he can be the one possibly that is doing that sort of role. So I wonder whether Mark Rutte is going to, rise. He might get more and more currency here in terms of international politics. Anyway, sorry, I am just spitballing and stream of consciousness, which, that's what you're here for, right? Something like that. Right, we're going to move on to talk about Moldova. So Moldova had their elections yesterday and a referendum. They had a massive interference from Russia. Russia spent millions and millions of dollars on disinformation campaigns that were mainly, I think they realised that Maya Sandu was probably going to get back in. Not that she has as a second round, but their money was better spent on derailing the referendum for accession to the EU. And what's really interesting, as I was looking last night, I was thinking, oh my God, so it's looking like Sandu's going to get the most votes in the first round if you don't get over 50%. So if you get over 50%, you get in as a president. So she's the incumbent president. She didn't get over 50%, but she got the most votes. And that was looking like that was going to happen anyway. So you're like, okay, that's looking good. But the referendum was not looking good. And as the night was going on, I'm like, ain't going to do it. The disinformation campaign is going to win. And then I wake up this morning, I'm like, holy cow, how did that happen? And it's very similar, as far as I can work out, to say US elections. And this is why Republicans often have a go at the process in the US by saying, oh, it's fake, it just gets changed at the end. But what often happens is your states have their big counties that have many more votes, which are often, obviously, the more votes, larger vote tallies come from urban counties, because cities have more people living in them than rural areas. What have I been telling you for a couple of years now is you've got rural-urban divide in terms of conservative liberal. So this is the same in the UK. It's the same it is the case across the US, whereby your lower populated counties in these states and lower populated states skew Republican. Bucolic heartlands and all this kind of like conservative ideals are much more aligned to rural living tradition, etc., and urban, where you're mixing huge numbers of people, you generally normalize different behavior, you normalize immigration, a lot of migrants go there, so you have these mixes of people that generally skew liberal. And in terms of voting, you will the smaller counties will count first because you're not counting much. You're like, oh, good, oh, this is good. So you'll have your rural areas counting first, and those stats will skew Republican or right wing, or in this case, anti-EU. So the Moldovan, I presume what's happened there is those smaller districts are skewing against the EU referendum. I mean, it was looking bad, but it was getting closer and closer and closer. And in the end, the yes won by the smallest of margins, but it was because, I presume, those urban areas came in later and later. And that's what people like hang on to in terms of cheating and this and that. But it's not. It's just how the counts work. It's just, we know this, but Anyway, Moldovan Central Election Commission processed 98.56% of the Euro integration. And by that stage, it was looking good for 4 there. A narrow difference of a little less than 1,000 votes. So this is, Moldova's not a huge country, but my goodness. Central Election Commission of Moldova has released preliminary results of the presidential election and constitutional referendum. Yes votes led with 50.16. And presidential election, although that's not finished yet. In fact, I think I have later numbers here. So 50.38 for yes, 49.62 for no. So in the end, the EU accession won just which, as Michael Weiss says, is especially impressive in light of the interference campaign. Moldova, this is a defeat for Russia, said key European lawmaker after nail-biting referendum. Moldova votes yes to joining EU by tiny margin, says Politico. Raising victory for EU forces was virtually certain, with 99.2% of votes counted as of late Monday morning. 50.3% of Moldovan voters backed changing the constitution to include EU membership, with 49.7% opposing the move. It's a long and nerve-wracking fight at midnight, with more than 90% of votes counted and yes lagging by almost 10 points. She had 90% of the votes counted and lagging by 10 points. So this is where you get, this is going to be cheating because you've only got 10% left over, and how can that skew? How can that all, go into, most of them go into this pile, into the yes? And it's because, like I say, if you're counting these ones later, then it will skew it. Yes. So overwhelming support for membership from the hundreds of thousands of Moldovans living in European countries. The US and Canada saw the gap narrow. So yeah, it's not only these urban-rural divides, but actually you've got those getting counted later are arguably the absentee ballots. And the absentee ballots are people, Moldovans living abroad, right? And they're going to be far more likely to be pro-European because they're literally living in the EU or living abroad, and therefore much more internationalist, much more globalist. And seeing Moldova from outside thinks, yeah, I want Moldova to be a global player and part of an international community. So again, those votes are much more likely to vote for EU accession. Right, okay, so then you have the presidential results. Now, Maya Sandu got 42.3%. Alexander Stoyanoglu got 26.1%, and someone else got 13.8%. Now, this guy got 26%, so a quarter of the vote. He is the pro-Russian guy. So the question is, who's more likely to get over 50% in the second round? Maya Sandu's 42.3 or 26.1% pro-Russian guy is almost certainly going to be Maya Sandu. So I would have thought is more likely to pick up these other, and there'll be other people underneath that to make up the total of 100%. So more likely to pick up third-party voters, I would have thought. Now, the Kremlin has demanded that Sandu provides evidence of legality in the elections. Moldovan President Maya Sandu must provide evidence of foreign interference in the presidential elections, said the press secretary of the Russian President Dmitry Peskov. Peskov should respect the sovereignty of independent Moldova and shut up, says Dmitry from War Translated. We are deeply concerned, says Renew Europe. So these are the centrists so remember, the European Parliament is made up of coalitions of different parties from individual countries. So, for example, if I was standing as a member of the European Parliament for, I don't know, SPD in Germany, so Olaf Scholz's party, right? Of course, the SPD is only from Germany, right? So when you go to European Parliament, there is no SPD from another country. These are individual countries' parties. So what they have to do is then work in coalitions of like-minded parties from other countries. So the European Parliament is made up of all these coalitions of like-minded parties. So you have your far left, your centre left, your Renew, which is your centrists, and slightly centre right as well. Renew I think is centrist, and then you have your centre right, and then you have all these different far right ones that are kind of growing in popularity. But Renew have said, we are deeply concerned by reports of criminal election interference and vote rigging in the elections in Moldova. Russia's hybrid war against democracies cannot be allowed to succeed. We stand with the Moldovan people and who want a European future. So that's good news that the right signals are coming out of Europe in support of Maya Sandu. Moldovan's president claims that Sandu herself claims that 300,000 votes were bought in fraud of unprecedented scale as first round of presidential election has taken place. Referendum on the EU accession passed by razor-thin margin. She will face pro-Russian candidate Stoyanoglu in a runoff, and you'd hope she'd win that. The GRU, so the Russian intelligence, hacked Georgia's Central Election Commission, likely gaining access to some email accounts and several media organisations. It also gained access to multiple IT systems at Georgia's National Railway Company for more than 2 years. Wow. So there you go. Russians have been hugely involved. Right, I'm going to do a thread by Carol Cadwalladr. So she was the journalist, has written for The Guardian previously, who was heavily involved in Brexit and tying Aaron Banks to Russian influence and the Russian influence of the Brexit referendum. Now, she is someone she's done TED Talks on, disinformation and the attacks on her and stuff. And she said, I just want to go through a general disinformation thread of hers that I think is important. So let's do this. Okay, deep breath. I think we may look back on this as the first great information war, except we're already 8 years in. The first great information war began in 2014. The invasion of Ukraine is the latest front, and the idea it doesn't already involve us is fiction, a lie, which is exactly what I keep saying. We are involved in a war, and the information war is part of it. It was Putin's fury at the removal of President Yanukovych in February 2014 that kicked everything off. Information operations were the first crucial step in invasion of the Crimea and Donbass, a deliberate attempt to warp reality and confuse both the Ukrainians and the world. This is not new. The Soviets had practiced desinformatia for years, but what was new in 2014 was technology, social media. It was a transformative movement, hybrid warfare and steroids, a golden Willy Wonka ticket to manipulate hearts and minds, almost completely invisibly. But it wasn't just Ukraine. We know that Russia began another offensive in February 2014 against West, specifically, but not exclusively, America. How do we know this? Because the FBI conducted a forensic, multi-year investigation that almost no one paid any attention to. The Mueller report, you've heard of it, but probably as a headline about how it didn't prove collusion between the Kremlin and the Trump campaign. We can come back to that. What it did prove, all caps, beyond any doubt, was that Russia attacked the 2016 US election through multiple routes. And just one of the ways Russia attacked the 2016 US election was via the tech platforms, especially Facebook. This was a military technique it pioneered in Ukraine in 2014. By 2016, it was refined, iterated, and supersized. It refined, iterated, and supersized these. Most brilliant of all, they were utterly invisible. And it wasn't just Russia. Companies such as Cambridge Analytica, political operatives such as Manafort, amoral opportunities such as Dominic Cummings in the UK, they learned how to exploit a platform that was totally open. Anyone could do so. And totally closed. No one could see how. But also, it was Russia. That's what the Mueller report proves. And again, Ukraine is at the centre of it all. Read Professor Tamsin Shaw's thread here. Note walking on role for Aaron Banks' business partner and his friend, the Russian spy. So that's, stuff that she's got her past involved in. Right, in 2016, we knew none of this. Russia and other bad actors acted with impunity and in some cases alignment. But now, through the sheer bloody hard work of academics, journalists and the FBI, we do know. But it was complex, messy, difficult, so we brushed it all under the carpet. We failed to acknowledge Russia had staged a military attack on the West. We called it meddling. We used words like interference. It wasn't, it was warfare. Boom. Boom. We've been under military attack for 8 years now. This is spot on. The failure is at the heart of what is happening now in Ukraine, because the first offensive of the Great Information War was from 2014 to 2022, and Putin won. And he won by convincing us it wasn't even a war. We fell for it. We said it was just ads and it didn't work anyhow, and a bot didn't tell me to vote. Facebook is still an open threat surface, exploited by authoritarians from the Philippines to India to Brazil to Hungary. It's maybe not a world war, but the world is at war. Meanwhile, in Britain, we're a captured state. In America, the institutions of government worked, even in spite of Trump. The authorities investigated, individuals were indicted, charged, jailed. The hostile actions of a foreign state examined and unpicked. Not that it mattered, the US media and therefore public failed to understand the real lessons of the Mueller report. And in the UK, we didn't even bother trying. We allowed Johnson's government to sweep 2016 under the carpet. Nigel Farage, Aaron Banks, Facebook, Russia, the lot. But it wasn't just ads, it was war. And it was absolutely crucial that we now understand that Putin's attack on Ukraine and the West was a joint attack on both. That began at the exact same time, across the exact same platforms. And this new front, the invasion of Ukraine, is not just about Ukraine. We are part of the plan. We've always been part of the plan. And Ukraine is not just fighting for Ukraine, but for the rest of us too. And maybe that could be why we failed to understand Putin's strategy in Ukraine, because it's not just a strategy in Ukraine. It's directed at us too. And that's what makes this such a uniquely perilous moment, not least because we still don't understand we're at war. If it helps, a penny dropped for me with Skripal, Sergei Skripal, the guy that was poisoned with Novichok in Salisbury. Planned by the GRU, Russia's military intelligence, as was a weaponized hack and leak of Hillary's emails. Military doctrine carried out by military officials in military operations, just like the one now in Ukraine. Absolutely brilliant. totally agree with that, Carol Cadwalladr. And I felt I had to share that with you. Now, Georgian. So the next place is Georgia. So Georgia is now 5 days away from its election on the 26th of October. Last night and this weekend, actually, there were huge demonstrations that were pro-EU. This was Tbilisi, and the choice was Europe. So Null Report says Georgia chooses the European Union. A massive opposition march is taking place in Tbilisi ahead of the parliamentary elections on the 26th. Meanwhile, Moldova is holding the first round of presidential elections and a constitutional referendum on EU integration, with 11 candidates running for presidency. So 11 candidates run there. So let's hope that Sandu picks up some of the votes from the others. Now, that is impressive. And you've had, so Georgian Dream, the party that runs on the behest of Ivanishvili, the guy that's no longer a politician, but he's a guy that funds it and is totally pro-Russian. That's what the voters are running against, really, and are fighting against, because they arguably will have to hope that the election can be free and fair, and it won't be dictated by Georgian Dream and rigged. Georgian president, though, so different from the prime minister, so she's Salome Zurabishvili, addressed the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Moldovan President Maya Sandu, and international partners. She emphasised at the weekend that Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression is also a fight for Georgia's freedom. Agreed. Expressing confidence in Zelensky's victory and their shared path towards Europe. So they are both looking at accession to Europe. At least Georgia was, but Georgian Dream have taken it in the different direction. And now the EU has said, and indeed the UK has stopped kind of close diplomatic ties with Georgia, but the EU has said, we're not doing accession talks anymore. You guys are going the wrong direction. So hopefully that will bring out enough of the Georgian population to vote in favour of a change of government that would be more Western looking. Okay, now on to the rest of the geopolitical stuff. So not as much stuff you'll be happy to know. So Ivana Stradner, who's a Balkans expert, said, I was just in Poland, and rightfully, people there don't trust any of them to protect Europe against Russia. What's she talking about? So President Biden has just come out and said, just a random tweet saying, well, not random, he was talking with the Quad. So it's the US, UK, France, and Germany. And then it was Italy involved as well, I think, as well. Actually not there. So France, Germany, and UK. So Biden came over and spoke to them, and Biden here says the United States will always stand with its friends for peace, security, and prosperity. But Ivana Stradner said, look, I've been over in Poland, I've been speaking to a bunch of people there, and rightfully, they don't trust any of them to protect Europe against Russia. I also spoke with many people in the Baltic countries who feel just the same way. Make no mistake, Putin won't stop in Ukraine, he's just buying more time. I sort of agree, but don't. I think he would be completely unable to continue a military move into Europe because, as I've shown you, as I've talked about earlier, I think the Russian army is not in a fit state to be, certainly with ground forces, to be able to take, and actually air forces either. I think the Navy is possibly okay due to the Arctic fleet, etc., but in terms of moving through Europe, I think it would take a long time for them to reconstitute. But there is still, they could seek to do that more through information warfare, the sort of which Carol Cadwalladr was talking about. So anyway, there are people in the Baltics and Poland thinking, America won't stand with us, or France, Germany, UK are not really on it. We are properly worried in Eastern Europe and in the Baltics that we are worried about the threat of Putin and Russia, and we're taking things into our own hands. So Representative Daniel Goldman on CNN has revealed that, quote, wittingly or unwittingly, House Republicans have been acting as an agent or asset for Russian intelligence for Vladimir Putin. Representative Goldman's assertion underscores concerns about the current state of the Republican Party. So goodness me, this is a bit of a worry. But we have heard this before, that people complaining that Russian propaganda is finding its way onto the floor in Congress, finding its way, through the loudspeakers of Marjorie Taylor Greene's mouth and others. there are, it appears Russian agents, whether unwittingly or not, active in Congress. Now, the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, has arrived in Kyiv for a surprise visit, and he's comes as questions arise about the long-term sustainability of Western support of Ukraine's war effort. And Britain and Germany have signed a historic security pact. Now, we'd already signed a security pact recently, so I don't know what the difference is here. The pact is expected to allow British and German forces to conduct joint military exercises on NATO's eastern border with Russia, most likely in Estonia and Lithuania, but not only there. So interesting stuff there. Britain has been seeking to get closer relationships with Europe. They've understood, I think Keir Starmer has understood that he can't take the UK back into the EU, at least not yet. You've got too many Leave voters that haven't died yet. And I say that because there's been these moves in the poll. I'm not saying that it's just like, oh, most Leave voters were old or whatever, but actually they did skew older. And there is a theory that the UK's readmission into the EU, if it's ever going to happen, you have to wait until some of these generations have died off and the younger people have sort of filtered through, and that change, that more open outlook to the EU might change the polls enough. Well, polls at the moment are already pro-EU. A majority is now pro-EU, so it has already changed. But it would be too, because half of the Labour electorate kind of went off and voted UKIP. So like Labour was split on Brexit, and that was why at the time you had Jeremy Corbyn, who himself was a Lexiteer, so that's a left-wing Brexit guy. So he was anti, because you got to understand that the EU is at heart a neoliberal economic free market trade bloc, really. So someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who's more into your kind of central planning, more old school socialist outlook, is like, But then the critics of the EU say, oh, there's all this regulation. But actually, yeah, it is just an inherent contradiction because it's neoliberal free market with regulation and moral and environmental outlook, etc., etc. So there's loads of interesting tensions there. But in terms of Labour, it knew that it couldn't be hard. It didn't land one way or the other on Brexit. It kind of left it up to the electorate and to individual people to campaign. And to some degree, the Conservatives as well. You had Conservative government called for it, but were for, David Cameron was all for EU. But then you had these other people who were against it in the Conservatives. So these parties are split. And for Keir Starmer, sorry, this is a long way to explain that what Keir Starmer is doing at the moment is trying to get closer relationships with Europe without re-entering Europe. So you're finding that he's doing all of these kind of bilateral deals or, say, security deals with the EU. It's not like we're not going to join the EU, but we're going to have a formal pact with the EU on X, Y, and Z. And it's kind of maybe a halfway house to integration with the EU, but it's necessary. From a want to be part of the EU or not, he needs to do that anyway. We need a security agreement with countries. Like, we can't be on our own outside of Europe. When you're looking at like BRICS and Russia and China, Iran, North Korea, like the UK, in order to stand up to that, we need to work very closely with allies. So that's NATO, but also the EU. So it's absolutely important that he does do this, not just from a EU admission by the back door, which I don't think that is. But if that was something you wanted later, then this is at least allowing that. Right, sorry. Poland will push for stronger sanctions on Russia during its presidency of the EU Council starting in 2025. So remember, we've got the rotating presidency now with Orban at the helm, and lots of people just not happy with that. Warsaw aims to tighten controls on Russian energy imports, including fuel and LNG, liquefied natural gas, with support from several EU countries. The focus will be on transparency in energy supplies and addressing sanctions circumvention. Although Hungary may oppose future sanctions, Ukraine is optimistic that Poland will drive decisive action to limit Russia's war capabilities. So this would be a really good change from get rid of Orban from having that rotating presidency, and we'll have the Polish not kind of in charge, but at least overseeing things, and they're going to be driving an agenda that is far more pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia. Right, interesting. I've long said that is it because I'm somewhat more favourable of Lula than his predecessor Jair Bolsonaro, who was a right-wing dictator wannabe, basically in charge of Brazil, who was absolutely destroying the rainforests and blah blah blah. Lula da Silva is your typical left winger, and he had all those issues. I've seen some very interesting documentaries on what happened in that intervening period of him being in charge, and Bolsonaro. Then he came back. He was kind of in prison, then not, and blah blah blah. Anyway, I don't think he's naturally a huge fan of Putin. But he also recognises that there are fertilizers and all sorts of imports and exports with Russia that are absolutely vital for Brazil. But he's also kind of going to be anti-American. So that places him in an interesting position. And I think sometimes when he thinks that says things that are supportive of Russia, I think he's really just trying to look out for Brazil. But he's also annoyingly not a huge supporter of Ukraine. And so he really annoys me, but he's also not what some people are painting him to be either. Like, he's not a fan of Putin. He's a bit out there. So CNN here reports that Brazilian President Lula was being injured in an accident and will not attend a BRICS summit in Russia. So there's a BRICS summit coming up in Kazan in Russia. Doctors diagnosed him with an injury to the BRICS summit in Russia in Kazan. Have diagnosed him with an injury to the back of his head. The medical team advised the president to avoid air travel, but allowed him to carry out his daily activities. You can do everything you want to do to run this country, but you can't go on a plane. To me, this sounds like he has manufactured an excuse not to go to BRICS. Now that is big, right? So don't, like, it may be that he did fall over and he can't get on a flight, right? Highly coincidental. To me, this is him trying to speak out both sides of his mouth. I don't think he's good enough on Ukraine. I do think he keeps trying to sell the peace plan between the China peace plan for is it a Brazil-China peace plan? So I don't think he's good on Ukraine. But what I'm trying to say here is he's also not a huge Putin-Russia fan either. And that means that he's got an interesting position, I guess, but an important position. You know, Brazil, they're a big player globally. Right. If I return to Russia, says Yulia Navalnaya, so this is Navalny's wife, or widow, sorry. Alexei Navalny, of course, died in prison. If I return to Russia, I will go to the elections as a presidential candidate. Wow, she said in an interview with BBC. This is big. According to her, returning to Moscow is unfortunately impossible. She said it ain't going to happen. It's impossible as long as Putin remains in power. But she noted that she was unable to come to her hometown even for her husband's funeral for fear of arrest. In Russia, a criminal case has been opened against her under the article on preparation of an extremist organisation, participation in an extremist organisation. But interestingly, she is laying the groundwork for an opposition leadership maybe to coalesce around her in exile. This is interesting. That's a big bit of news. That don't underplay that. That's huge. Like, going forward, that is an announcement. That is a shot potentially across. You know, that is a broadside on Putin here. Shot across the bows. I'm here. You don't like me. I don't like you. Next time I'm in that country, I'm going to be freaking running for president. Now you'll get a lot of people in Russia maybe going, oh, okay. Who, you know, the classic Navalny fans are maybe in exile around the world, and some money flowing in, and you get Western support for this, and you could get a meaningful opposition movement, a Russian opposition movement. I was always wondering whether she would do this, and I've looked at, so watching the Navalny documentary, I did have half an eye on, could I see her? Does she have what it takes to be, you know, you're trying to work out, are you a politician or are you a politician's spouse? Like, trying to work out, could I see you? Are you the sort of person that wants to be? Could you see yourself as this person? Interesting. Keep an eye on that. Anyway, that's enough from me. I've been babbling on for way too long. Take care, guys. Speak soon. Toodle pips.